Happy Monday, everyone, from very chilly Indianapolis on this Monday inauguration, Martin Luther King National Football College Championship Day. It's a big day, and it's also another Live with Kevin. I'm glad that you're here with us. Not necessarily in that order for those three things, but all three of those things are happening. All four, counting to us, all four of those things happened today, and so glad that you're here. If you're with us live, I have a little task for you, and that is for you to say hello. Tell us where you're listening from. So whatever social platform that you're getting this live stream on, just say hello. Tell us where you're from. That would be great. My guest and I would love to know that. And we may even say hello. But beyond that, I'm asking you to do that, not just for selfish reasons, so I know where you're from. I'm asking you to do that because that improves the chances that you'll actually engage with us in this conversation, which is ultimately what I hope you will do. If you're with us live, I want you to imagine that we were all in the same room. And Christie and I aren't in the same room either, but imagine we were all in the same room having a conversation. You were sitting at the table with us. If you had a question, you'd ask it. If you had a comment, you'd share it. If you had an idea, you would offer it, right? You would naturally do those things. Well, you can still do those things by letting your fingers do the walking. So I hope that you'll do that, because when you do, we'll have a better conversation. You'll get more value from this time, and ultimately you will help us create a better podcast. So if you didn't notice this, you see up over my shoulder that this will eventually be an episode as well of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. It won't come out there and for about 3 months. So you're getting a big advantage. You're getting a bigger advantage today because the book I'm going to introduce you to and the guest I'm going to introduce you to, her book, as I'm sitting here live, comes out in 2 days. So I'm excited to have you. And so with that, all that said, I'm going to do the countdown for where we will cut this for the podcast itself. And so Marissa, this is for you in 3, 2, 1. Work and the conditions and implications of it continue to change. And even in the face of technology, business is still driven and powered by humans. Today, we are talking about how all this is connected and how, as we consider human-powered leadership. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders like you grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast, you could join us in the future live, where you can get this information sooner on your favorite social media channel where we live stream. So you can find out about when those future live episodes are happening and get connected with us, and therefore, of course, interact and see these sooner. You can do all that by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. Hope you'll do those things. I just want to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by my latest book. As you're hearing these words on the podcast, it's been out a few weeks. Flexible Leadership: Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's time to realize that styles can get in our way and that following our strengths might not always be the best approach. In a world more complex and uncertain than ever, leaders need a new perspective and a new set of tools to create the great results for their organizations and team members. That's what Flexible Leadership provides you. You can learn more and order your copy today. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/flexible. Hope you'll do that. And with that, let me bring in my guest and I will introduce her and we will get started. Her name is Dr. Christie Smith. She has over 35 years of experience advising the C-suite of Fortune 500 companies. She's the founder of the Humanity Studio, a research and advisory institute dedicated to improving the way we live by revolutionizing the way we work. She has held global leadership positions at Deloitte, Apple, and Accenture as a highly respected expert in leadership, talent development, organizational design, workforce management, change management, and executive team performance. She's a speaker on business strategy, leadership and culture, DEI, people analytics, and the impact of workforce technologies and AI. She earned her doctorate in clinical social work with a focus on leadership and culture from New York University. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Fortune, and CNN, and now in her brand new book that she's co-authored with Kelly Monahan, Essential: How Distributed Teams, Generative AI, and Global Shifts Are Creating a New human-powered leadership. Christie, I've said all that stuff. Why would they not want to know you? Welcome.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
It's my pleasure to have you, and so excited as we're doing this live 2 days before the drop or launch or pub date, whatever word you want to use, of the new book. We're so excited. For all of you that are listening to this later on the podcast, of course, you'll be able to get it, and we'll tell you all about how to do that as we go. So Christie, I said a few things about your past in the intro here, but what's the journey? What leads you to this place of writing this book? I'm guessing when you were 5, 8, 10, you weren't thinking you were going to write a book. You probably had some other sort of career or life aspirations. Tell us just a little bit about the journey as it connects to and leads to the book.
Yeah, I think, Kevin, it's interesting that you talked about me being 5. I actually think that the journey to writing this book has been a lifelong endeavor. I grew up the youngest of 8 kids, and so grew up in the late 60s and 70s, where the conversation around our dining room table was certainly about service, was about our obligation as an upper middle class family to be the voice for the voiceless. It was an era where we were grappling as a nation and as a world with the Vietnam War, with the Cold War, looking at women's rights, civil rights, all of these things. And so there was an obligation around the table, no matter being the youngest, that we contribute to the advancement of the conversation, awareness, and education, and to, again, be that voice for the voiceless. So I think everything started around that dining room table.
That's one I've asked that question now 400 and some times, and I don't know anyone has given me a more direct through line than that. So that's really very cool. So, all right, if in some ways I kind of putting words in your mouth here, but
Sure.
in some ways your whole life has led up to this book.
Yep.
Why now? Like there's stuff in the subtitle, distributed teams, generative AI, global shifts, but why now? Why this book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that now is because of the gift of time. I, left the corporate world last August. And, my entire career, as I've said, has been in the pursuit of helping others be excellent. As a consultant, certainly as a vice president at Apple, my work has been about what are the systems I'm part of as an organization, those systems I've been invited into, and organizations I've been invited into as a consultant, and to make them better. Now, I think we are at an unusual time in our world today, and looking at the culmination of issues that leaders are facing and that employees are facing with war in Europe, in the Middle East, with socioeconomic and political pressure, with a skills shortage, with employee engagement at an all-time low. Multiple things are, and technology, of course, these things are impacting the way work gets done and the humanity in the workplace like they've never been before. And so Kelly and I really felt that there was no definitive book out there talking about the totality of these issues on leadership. Rather, there was one-offs that people were addressing. And so we really wanted to look at how do all of these things impact leadership and the humanity in our workplaces.
So I'm going to ask you an impossible question, and I'm going to tell you up front that it's an impossible question, because I think about the book in 3 parts, and the whole first chunk of the book, from my perspective, is about that sort of level setting about where we are and why we're at the point that we're at. And so the impossible question is, if you had to say one thing now, like what's what's one of those things that maybe is that you're thinking about the most right now, or maybe that's even a little different than as you finish the book, what, or even just the thing that you would want to frame the rest of sort of our time together about, of all of that sort of context setting about where we're living and working now?
Yep.
What would be that thing that you'd want to start us with?
That leadership is hard. It's really hard today. And
Well, it's never been easy.
never been easy, never been easy, but the requirements of leadership from employees, from a shift from being fiduciaries of a P&L or a product line or what have you, um, to being global citizens and having to weigh into socio-political, economic issues, and the rise of technology and the pace of change, all of these things makes leadership incredibly difficult, and therefore we need a new playbook.
So we're going to talk about that playbook a little bit, but one of the things that you bring out in the early, well, let me do this. I'm going to go to a different place. So you've talked about how the world is changing.
Yep.
And stuff's happening fast. I think everyone who's listening would nod their head. A wise person asked me, another author asked me several books ago, and they said, Kevin, what have you learned since you wrote it? Because as you well know, it's been a while since you wrote the words that I read this weekend,
Yeah.
and that others will be able to read soon. What have you learned since then? Stated a different way is what maybe you kind of wish was in the book now, based on what you know now, that isn't.
I think it's a great question. I would say that, we wrote this book fairly quickly. So, we started this endeavor, about the beginning of last year, and finished it in about 7 or 8 months. I think that if I were to point to anything that is even more pressing, it's the issue of polarization. It's the issue of how we have lost the art, and leaders need this art desperately, the art of holding the conversation in the middle. And how do we have that conversation in the middle? I think that very well may be the subject of the next book.
That's a great way to frame it. And I think that that is a real issue. And I think it's maybe one of the reasons leadership is hard, but it's also one of the ways that leaders, I'm a big believer that, nothing positive happens in the world without someone leading us there. And there's no
Yeah.
reason why those of us listening can't be among those leading us to that place of being able to have a conversation in the middle, and even being able to have a conversation if we know our politics, for example. That's not the only thing we're polarized about, that where we might know our politics are different, and yet we can still even have a conversation, period, which in
Yeah.
many cases has been a challenge, I think, for a lot of folks.
Well, and I just might add, civil discourse, and
100%.
underscore civil is something that I think really does fall on the shoulders of the private sector and leaders in the private sector, as leaders have really moved, as I said, from that kind of shareholder, fiduciary responsibility to more global citizens. We are looking for leaders everywhere in our society today, and we are looking for leaders most, notably in business, to help us navigate socio-political and economic conditions. And so therefore, I think, that makes, leadership really hard. But I also think it requires this ability to hold, civil discourse and have conversations that are fundamentally different than we're having in a much more broader sense in a polarized world.
I love that. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and
Sure.
say, and take us to another place. One of the things that I believe that you believe is that in some ways we're living in a modern renaissance. And I'd love for you to say a little more about that, because so far we've been sort of saying, hey, it's hard, hey, it's difficult, hey, look at all these challenges. And yet, when I hear that idea, that feels very hopeful
Yeah.
to me. So, first of all, do I have this right? And then, secondly, what does that mean, and why do you say it?
Well, it's a wonderful question, because we even in the book start the book out with, historically, how the Black Plague led to the Renaissance in Europe, with the appreciation of putting humans at the center, art, the sciences, music. All of those things were born out of this tragedy of the Black Plague. And so we, talk about that parallel of coming out of COVID and the Renaissance period that we, have had, with the refocus on humans and humans at work, how, when, and where we work. What are the tools and the innovations? What's the appreciation for art, music, that kind of thing that, Steve Jobs so beautifully talked about when he started Apple, which is the intersection of art and science, right? How do we bring those things together? And I think early on, post-pandemic, we were very much focused on humanity at the center of the arts and sciences. And so, this book is really looking at, okay, so given, yes, given the reality of this renaissance, and with the pace of change and the pace of technology and the pace that we are moving in terms of growth and human need, right? How do we how do we all emerge as leaders that can covet that and can nurture it?
We're going to talk about some of the ways that we can do that in a minute. Before we get there, though, in the chapter where you're talking about sort of the digital stuff, the generative AI stuff, you make you write, the two of you write something which I really like, and I'm going to read it and let you comment on it. And you use a word, gray collar. So I'm going to ask you to describe that. I don't think everyone may know what that is, but let me read the quote first, because it's under everybody, the subtitle of the section called Centering Humans in the Digital Age. And they write, in other words, to stay ahead of the digital age, leaders will not only have to upskill workers, especially those considered gray collar, but redefine what it means to engage a workforce with increased say and growing expectations for leaders themselves. So there's quite a bit we could unpack there. So start by telling everyone what you mean by, again, gray collar. Maybe not everyone quite understands that. I think that's useful in and of itself. And then let's unpack that idea a little bit more.
So we've always talked about our workforce in two extremes, right? Blue collar workers, who are healthcare workers, plumbers, electricians, those people who are really doing manual labor. And then we've talked about white collar workers, who are in our offices, who are knowledge workers, who are more analytical, what have you, may be very technically inclined, obviously, with the rise of technology and innovation. But we've really talked about only two segments of our population. What we wanted to do was introduce a third population that overlaps on both, which is what we call gray collar workers. And gray collar workers are those individuals who have to kind of borrow from both of those extremes in order to get their job done. So if you look at, let's talk about automotive, for instance, and you look at automotive workers, even when I go get an oil change or a checkup on my car, that individual needs to understand the electronics within my car like they've never had to understand before, in order to reset, recalibrate, all of those types of things. They are using technology, and in some cases AI, right, to understand the machine. The same is true for, and we would call that gray collar workers. That requires a whole different set of education. For white collar workers, they need to understand how things work fundamentally differently, and the technologies that exist today. I mean, when we looked at research where we looked at thousands of senior leaders who said, yes, technology is going to change everything, and we know we need to meet this time and that change today, only 25% of those leaders were even considering doing something about it.
Right.
Because the technology is intimidating. So this notion of a third category of worker in our society called a gray collar worker is growing. We need the educational and skills development infrastructure. Skills are outpacing today our educational systems, and traditional employment models for learning and development simply can't adapt.
Yeah, I would argue that that's where all of the job growth is, right? And all the conversation about reskilling, upskilling, what are the jobs going to be in the future? They almost all fall in there, as opposed to in the pure white collar, pure blue collar. In fact, I think of almost everyone that I know, and most all of our clients, and the folks in their organizations. I find it hard at this point to identify very many people who are truly blue collar.
Right.
And I think that's, it's like anything else, there's gradations, but I think that point alone is really important for us to get as leaders, to figure out and to understand. And I mean, I was having a conversation with a client 30 minutes, Christie, before we started, and we were talking about sort of two parts of the organization, kind of in this sort of, white collar, blue collar. They didn't use that language. And yet those distinctions become less and less important when we start to realize how much is really happening in the middle.
That's right.
I love
That's
that.
Right.
So I want to shift gears. You talk I said there's sort of three parts to the book, in my opinion. Next part, you talk about three things that it won't surprise you that we've had conversations on this podcast about, like the importance of purpose, well-being, and connection. But the fourth one is agency. And I'd like to talk about that one, even though all of it is important. I'd like to talk about agency as it relates to how people are feeling about. Oh, first of all, before I go there, when I say the word agency to you, as a human powered leader, what should we be thinking about as it relates to agency? Let's just start there.
Yeah, I think that we should be thinking about empowerment. How do we understand our employees in a way, and this is the new playbook or model that we introduce, this is an element of it, is to how do we know our employees and the humanity within our workplace well enough that we can empower them to either structure their work, do their work, actually define who they are beyond a set of competencies or a job title or the color of their skin or their gender, to really contribute to the organization, the team, and what needs to be done.
So why, how do we do that, especially in a time when there's all the conversation and even all the experience that people might have who are listening around using technology like generative AI, for example? How do we as leaders cultivate this sense of agency, and how does that intersect and connect with things like generative AI?
Yeah. So we have to fast forward, right, to what is this new model of leadership that we are talking about in the book. Most of the listeners who are listening to this understand this concept of emotional intelligence, which is this idea, and we see lots of leaders talking about this today, this idea of understanding myself and the attributes I need to create for myself as a leader. It's an internal job, things like empathy, compassion, transparency, all of those things. You take a nice little test from emotional intelligence. It tells you where you fall on some of these attributes and what you need to do to cultivate them. And that's great. It's a precursor to what we call emotionally mature leaders, right? Now, the difference between emotional intelligence and emotional maturity is, as I said, emotional intelligence is all about you, right? Emotional maturity is all about the humanity in your organization, which is the attributes of emotional maturity are suspension of self-interest, insatiable curiosity about the people that work with you, understanding the context in which they're coming to work and doing their work. It is about cultivating cultures of excellence that give people a sense on your team and architect the team that here's the work that we together define that you need to do that gives purpose, agency, a sense of connection, a sense of well-being in the work that you do, and then certainly meeting those human requirements that we lay out in the book. So this evolution from intelligence to maturity is really a shift from self-focused to human-focused.
And we were going to get there, and it's great that we went there. In the book, you call it what you just described to us as the essential leadership flywheel. So a couple
Correct.
pieces that I want to talk a little bit more about, and one of them is this idea that well, it's not about us, right? And you said it, and in the book you talk about it as being the mindset of suspending self-interest.
Yep.
Hard. Right.
Super hard.
Not exactly how humans are generally wired. So talk about that. Like, I think, listen, those of you that are listening are likely in a subset of all leaders because you're choosing to listen to this or watch this. And so Christie, at some level, you're speaking to the choir here, because chances are most people here intellectually get this idea. Yeah, it's not about me. I have to suspend my self-interest. And it's hard, as you said. Give us a couple of things that we can do to help us shift this mindset, remind ourselves of this mindset, move in the direction of this approach.
Yeah. Well, let's, in order to give you that, let's first start with some realities in the workplace today, which point to the need for a suspension of self-interest. Number one, we are experiencing the lowest scores on corporate leadership trust that we've ever had globally. So we are looking at the Edelman Trust Survey says that 62% of people trust their organizational leaders. Now, 62% is misleading because that includes countries like China, the UAE, Russia, right, where it's a little difficult to speak out, right? And so you're really looking at more in the 40 percentile for Western countries, right? So, so that's number one. Trust is at an all-time low. Number two, we are looking at an epidemic of employee disengagement that's costing us $8.8 trillion a year. Now, if you put that 8.8 trillion into context, that's like saying the combination of annual revenue of Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon together a year, plus $322 billion of mental health issues that we're paying for and burnout with employees a year. So we've got an economic crisis boiling as a result of this, right? So if that is the precursor, lack of trust, lack of engagement, when we examine why are those things happening, it's because leaders only care about themselves. right? That it's about their productivity number, it's about their revenue number, it's about their bonus. And we all know leaders like this. Now, I'm not vilifying that. That is human nature. It's how we were all raised in our organizations. I get it, right? What's going to be my bonus at the end of the year? What's going to be my rating at the end of the year? How am I going to take care of my own? Those are very natural things. However, they don't meet the time that we're in today because of those economic realities that I just talked about. So, this notion of what we used to call servant leadership, this notion of suspension of self interest so that I can understand my team and my employees to such a point where I'm structuring the work and architecting how we get that work done so that we meet better productivity goals, that we meet better revenue goals, that when I suspend self-interest and am invested tirelessly in our people, all the rest will come.
Yeah, it's the other way. It's the other way. I got to get mine,
around.
and then it's the other way around, and then everyone can win. The other thing that I just love the phrase that you use, and before we started before I hit the record button here, you were asking me about my new book, and I said there's one thing in your book that is a really close connection to what I've written about in flexible leadership, and it's this idea of context. And you talk about it. The two of you talk about it as contextual competency, and I love that frame for it. So say a little bit more about it, because I'm with you that the context in which we lead matters a huge amount. Really, that's what this whole conversation has been about.
That's right.
And that's true at the macro level. It's also true at the micro level, and I do believe it's a competency. So say a little bit more about what you mean there.
Well, I think that you're right about the micro and the macro, right? When I started and we started talking about how difficult leadership is, well, let's look at the context of leadership today in the world that we live in. It's got all of those headwinds that we have already talked about. But if you think about on the micro level, I mean, Kevin, I am sure you and I are of the same age when we entered into the workplace where we had to check our humanity at the door. You came to work, you didn't talk about life, you didn't talk about what was happening outside work. You came and you did your job and you did it with excellence, and that was it, right? That is not the world we live in today. So understanding the context in which people, and this is where it's tied to insatiable curiosity, understanding the context in which people are coming to work to do their work and why they may be working with one hand tied behind their back, whether that is because they are dealing with childcare, elder care, a divorce, a child with autism, whatever it is, we come to work, right, within a context of what's happening in our lives. Now, do we have to disclose all of that and bare our soul to our leaders? No. But what leaders need to do is understand that the people who are on their team are coming with challenges of their own. And my job as a leader is to make the job easier and to understand the context in which that person's coming to their job, and have the flexibility to help them, achieve beyond their wildest dreams, their work, despite the conflicts or the issues that they may be bringing into work. So this notion of contextual competence and understanding your team and what their own, pardon the consultant phrase, headwinds may be, is something that I, as a leader, need to do in order to help them achieve their professional goals.
Yeah, I think that's so right. The longer that I live and the longer that I do this work, the more I think that context is supremely important, more profoundly important.
Mm-hmm.
Again, at the macro level, as we've talked a great deal about in this conversation, as well as at the micro level. And so I've got a couple other things, Christie, I want to ask you before we finish. A couple of things that I like to ask people in this setting. This is well, I'll get there in a second. Let me ask this first. What do you like to do for fun?
I love to play golf. I still consider myself, an athlete. That's the brand I grew up with in that big family I talked about earlier. So, triathlons, running, weight training, all of those things, I absolutely love. And most importantly, time, with my family.
Awesome. And the only thing you knew for sure I was going to ask you is this next question. And I'm going to put context around it for everybody. So if you've listened before, you probably know what question I'm about to ask. Christie knows because it's the only one I told her I was going to ask. But I'll give everybody a little context for that. Ever since I was a kid, I've found that when I met smart people that I admired, I always wanted to ask them this question. So what are you reading?
Yeah.
And so when I started doing this show, I'm like, well, why wouldn't I do that? Ask that question, not just for me, but for everyone else that gets to hear it. So Christie, what are you reading these days?
Yeah, so I'm reading a bunch of different things, right? Certainly Adam Grant's work I absolutely love. So his new book I am reading. I love Mel Robbins' new book, Let Them. I think that is fascinating. Um, I love history and the stories of history. So with Winston Churchill's biography. So I jump back and forth. I also really enjoy, a daily feed of all of the newspapers and, magazines that I love, whether it be The Economist or the Financial Times or the Journal, what have you, New York Times, all of that. I just love information.
We will have all that for you, as well as a link to Christie's book, which is the question you really wanted me to ask from the beginning, Christie. So, like, where can we learn more about you? Where can people go to get the book? Like, what do you want to tell people?
Sure.
How do they connect with
Well,
you?
yeah. So I appreciate you asking. You can buy the book on your favorite book websites or in your bookstores. Certainly is listed on Amazon, Goodreads, and many others. You can go to smith-monahan.com, which is the book's website. So please, take advantage of that. I am working now on a project since I've left the corporate world called the Humanity Studio, which is a leadership advisory firm. And so you can find thehumanitystudio.com, find more about me, the book, and everything else. So I appreciate you asking and really look forward to hearing people's views on the book.
thehumanitystudio.com and smithmonahan.com. The book is titled Essential: How Distributed Teams, Generative AI, and Global Shifts Are Creating a New Human-Powered Leadership. Christie, it's been a pleasure to have you. But before we say our goodbyes, I've got a question that I ask all of you. And again, it's the thing I ask you every single episode. It's the most important question that you could ask yourself before we finish. And that is, now what? What are you going to do with what you just heard? Just having heard it, found it to be interesting, better than doing your exercise with only your own thoughts. Like, that's one thing. But what we'd really hope is that you take some action with what you learned. Close the gap between, oh, I learned this, and what am I going to do with this? I have my own notes. My notes don't matter. What matters are the things that you thought of, the actions that you want to take. Certainly, we would hope that one of those is to order a copy of the book, Essential. But beyond that, what actions will you take for having been here? Because it's in that you have the chance to lead differently and start to make a bigger positive difference in the world. Christie, thank you for being here. Such a pleasure to have you. I enjoyed our conversation. I hope you did as well.
Thank you, Kevin. It was so much fun to be with you.
Everybody, that's it for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed it, make sure you are subscribed wherever you're listening, or make sure that you're telling others they should come listen to, whether it's to this episode or the next episode, because there'll be another episode next week when we'll be back with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We'll see you then.